This lesson will look at the future of globalisation and at the direction in which it may potentially move in the future. Although, to be quite honest, making any kind of prediction about globalisation is probably doomed to failure. Perhaps the only logical place to start to answer this question is with the data, and as outlined in Lesson 9, the most reliable statistical information can be obtained from the COF index. Looking at the COF index from 1980 to 2013, a very clear pattern emerges, as shown in this graph. Until 2007, there are sharp year-on-year rises, meaning that the global average level of globalisation was going up, meaning that the world was becoming more globalised. From 2007 onwards, this graph starts to stagnate, suggesting that globalisation is flatlining, or indeed turning downwards. The latest report suggests that this trend is particularly pronounced in industrialised countries. Similarly, the current slow levels of global economic growth may suggest that the benefits of globalisation have now peaked, and that while they will continue to grow, it will be at a lower rate than before. One significant reason for this is that China, which has driven so much of this growth, is now recording single rather than double-digit GDP growth, and is changing the framework of its economy away from being primarily manufacturing-based. To examine this question in more specific detail, and to evaluate it from an economic, political, and cultural perspective, we'll now look at two specific ongoing issues which may give an indication of the direction of travel: the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the extent of political freedom worldwide, and the rise of China, and the mass increase in the availability of technology throughout the world. In terms of the deepening financial links between nation states, one major event on the economic horizon is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a proposed trade agreement between the European Union and the United States. Its aim is to promote trade and multilateral economic growth. One of its major goals is to cut tariffs, that is, taxes on imported goods. According to the European Commission, the TTIP would boost the EU's economy by €120 billion, the US economy by €90 billion, and the rest of the world by €100 billion. At present, it is unclear when, or indeed if, it will come online, since there is a significant amount of opposition to the TTIP, which reveals some of the major fault lines in the debate about globalisation. While the TTIP fits very neatly into the neoliberal model of globalisation supported by some, others are deeply concerned about the power which it gives to big corporations. One of the provisions of the TTIP is something called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, which essentially allows the companies to argue disputes outside of a normal court system. Another potential problem of the TTIP is something which was flagged up in Lesson 8, regarding the fact that the EU and the US have very different laws. One specific issue which has been cited is that of car horns, which in the US has to be labelled with the word horn, something which in the multilingual environment of the EU would be problematic. In conclusion, should the TTIP come online, and if the doubters are silenced, it would lead to further and very significant increase in global capital flows, and the increased flow of goods would lead to further social and cultural hybridization. It would also require greater legal integration. Attempts to increase political freedom around the world have gone hand in hand with the drive towards economic freedom, which has been such a key feature of modern globalization. It is arguable that the high point of modern globalization came in 1989 and the years following, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the triumph of Western liberal democracy. Certainly this was the argument of Francis Fukuyama in the title of his provocative 1992 book, The End of History, in which he argues that humanity had reached the end point of its socio-cultural evolution and attained the final form of human government. Interestingly, in this book, Fukuyama also makes the case for the continuation of the nation-state when he states, The nation will continue to be a central pole of identification, even if more and more nations come to share common economic and political forms of organisation. However, in counterpoint to this argument is the direction of travel that political rights and freedom appear to be moving in. According to Freedom House, a respected US-based think tank, the extent of political freedoms has declined every year since 2005. For 2016, their report looked at factors such as the Syrian refugee crisis, the slowdown of China's economy, the rise of cross-border terrorism, and the rise of commodity prices to identify two major global trends which do not point to a world becoming more streamlined or harmonized. The increase of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racism in democratic countries, and authoritarian regimes cracking down harder on dissent. Related to this may be the fact that what we are seeing here is the embryonic phase of a change from an American-led and influenced globalization to one where China is in the lead, a process we might describe as sinicization. It is not only in China's regional sphere of influence where their influence is increasing, but in many places in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere as well. For example, China is using its economic might to invest across the developing world. In 2014 alone, they invested over $70 billion in construction contracts in Africa. China's soft power across much of the world is rising sharply. Other countries, particularly oil-rich nations in the Middle East, have also used their economic power through the vehicle of sovereign wealth funds to invest heavily across the world, but particularly in the West. Often these investments are in prized assets of firms which have important national or domestic status, which can lead, in turn, to an increase in cultural misunderstanding. Related to this may be the fact that what we are seeing here is the embryonic phase of a change from an American-led and influenced globalization to one where China is in the lead, a process we might describe as sinicization. It is not only in China's regional sphere of influence where their influence is increasing, but in many places in Africa and Latin America as well. China is using its economic might to invest across the developing world. In 2014 alone, they invested over $70 billion in construction contracts in Africa. China's soft power across much of the world is rising sharply. Other countries, particularly oil-rich nations in the Middle East, have also used their economic power through the vehicle of sovereign wealth funds to invest heavily across the world, particularly in the West. Often these investments are in prized assets of firms which have important national or domestic status, which can lead, in turn, to an increase in cultural misunderstanding. Paradoxically, it appears that at the point when countries are becoming less democratic and people's rights are being squeezed, they stand at the cusp of an enormous revolution in terms of access to information and data. While smartphone use has increased hugely in the West, there are many parts of the world which it has yet to reach in a meaningful way. Over the next 5 years or so, it is predicted that the availability of smartphones is going to exponentially increase, potentially reaching 6 billion units by 2020. As these units become cheaper and become available to more people, it will give even those in lower socio-economic classes the opportunity to access knowledge at their fingertips. In turn, this democratization of knowledge could lead to profound educational and political changes within society, and the ability for many of those who have been sidelined it to truly benefit from globalization once and for all. Part of the reason the picture is so confused is that there are so many competing forces. Understanding globalization is not like trying to understand the Cold War, where there were two competing ideologies. In a heavily globalized world, there are not two dimensions, but thousands of dimensions. There is no meta-narrative, no clear sense of where the world is going or where people want it to go. The forces of globalization have been unleashed. They have emerged out of Pandora's box, and there is no real way of knowing where things are going to go. But one thing is for sure, it's going to be very interesting to see. We've now reached the end. We've now reached the end of this Introduction to Globalization course. If you've followed it all the way, congratulations, and I hope it was enjoyable, interesting, and educational. I thought I would just end with a more direct expression of my own views about globalization, which you are, of course, free to disagree or agree with as you see fit. In a world which is enormously richer than it was a generation ago, the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, estimate that 3/4 of the world's population lives in societies where income distribution is less equal now than it was in the 1990s. To my mind, in economic terms at any rate, there is no point in creating a bigger cake if those at the bottom are only picking up crumbs. I'll now close with a quotation from the United Nations, which sums up my own views about globalization in terms of what it has achieved to date and its potential for the future. It reads as follows. The greatest challenge we face today is to ensure that globalization becomes a positive force for all the world's people, instead of leaving billions of them behind in squalor. Inclusive globalization must be built on the great enabling force of the market, but market forces alone will not achieve it. It requires a broader effort to create a shared future, based upon our common humanity in all its diversity.